Professor Ben Friedman, it's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you.
Can you share a time when you changed a long-held belief and what influenced that change?
I don't think I can identify specifically the time, but I'll give you the subject on which I've changed my views over the years, and that's climate change. I have to admit that, like most economists, I was slow in coming to the realization that climate change is going to be as well as serious in its social consequences as it's turning out to be, and as expensive in terms of the economics. For quite some time, I understood, yes, of course, putting all this carbon into the atmosphere was going to make the Earth a warmer planet. I understood that, but I suppose I thought that this would take place more slowly over an expended period of time. And I also, I think, believe that damage this would inflict would be more localized and therefore more subject to remediation. But as time goes by, most of us pay attention to what's happening in the world. I'd like to think I do too. And with the accumulation of evidence over, say, the past 10 years or so, I think I've changed my mind, and I think this is now a very serious problem. I think the consequences like rising sea level are taking place more rapidly than we thought before. Things like the rising temperature of the ocean, which is important for the kinds of storms that we get in many parts of the country, including, incidentally, in the United States. And also, I've come to see that the consequences are less localized than I thought they would be. And once we talk about consequences that are pretty much everywhere, it becomes much harder to think concretely about remediation. If we thought this was just a problem of rising sea levels, well, we could talk about what port cities, exposed places on coastlines could do. But I think that's not right. So this is an area and an important one for me because, after all, I'm an economist. I'm interested in public policy, and it's an important one for me, both because it has to do with how much we ought to be willing to pay as a society to mitigate the speed of an extent of climate change, but also how much we are going to have to pay in order to remedy the consequences. So it's a first magnitude issue, and I'll be honest and say I've changed my mind on it within the past 10 years or so.
And has this influenced or altered your actions in any way?
Has it altered my actions? Depends on what you mean by an action. I'm not an activist. I'm not involved directly in political things. I talk to political candidates and office holders from time to time. But what I primarily do is teach and write. I'm a university professor. And so I would say yes, to that extent. The discussion of climate change issues in the courses that I teach for students at Harvard look different in that respect than they did 15 years ago. And that's a result of the fact that I've changed my mind in ways that we just discussed. And to the extent that some, not all, but some of my writing on appropriate public policies for the United States bear on this issue, then yes, I would say it shows up in my writings as well.
Are there any beliefs you feel you will never abandon and why?
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, like any Westerner, I suppose. I'm deeply, deeply a child of the Enlightenment. My favorite books of the Bible are the Book of Locke, the Book of Jefferson, the Book of Hamilton, the Book of Adams. These are the primary books of the Bible for me as an American. And so I think the core Enlightenment values having to do with the value of reason, the worth of the individual human being, the importance of ideas, the moral commitment to tolerance. And you could ask tolerance with respect to what? Look, I'm an American, therefore I would immediately think about race relations. I would also think about ethnic tensions. I would think about issues of religious prejudice, possibly. If I were a European, I might think differently. If I were an Asian, I might think differently, but I'm not. I'm an American. And so I think these core Enlightenment values are so deeply ingrained, not just as a matter of education, but just as part of the air we breathe, the soil in which we live as Americans, that I can't imagine a circumstance in which I would say, no, I think Locke and Montesquieu were on the wrong track and we should reject all that. That's just inconceivable for me.
What does it mean to disagree well?
That's a very interesting question. You have to be willing to listen to what other people say, which is different from having to agree with them. Lots of people say things that are wrong. Again, I'm an economist. Economics is a subject on which lots of people turn out to have wrong ideas. And I don't think one should be hesitant to say so. Have to listen carefully to make sure we understand what the other person is saying. But when the other person says something that's wrong, I think it's an obligation of economists to say so. And no doubt this is true in other respects. Again, I approach your question from the perspective of a university professor. I like teaching small classes in which we have plenty of time for discussion. I tell students that they should deal with each other respectfully, but not be afraid to say that they disagree. I try in my courses to bring out respectful disagreements. I tell students that they should approach our discussions with an open mind, but an open mind does not mean an empty mind. You're entitled to know something. In fact, you're expected to know something. And when somebody says something that contradicts something that you believe to be true, it's incumbent upon you to say so. So I have lots of devices that I've used and developed over the years, none of which are unique to me. I don't pretend to be any great creator of pedagogical technique, but over the years, I've found that lots of things work. Again, approaching subjects and being honest with students right up front that we're talking about hard issues to which there are not necessarily right answers. Now, I said a minute ago that in economics, there are plenty of people who have wrong views, but that's because there are some things we know. But it's important to distinguish between the things that we actually know and the things that we don't. And so on issues where we know something, we should say so. But on those where we don't know, well, we have to listen to and bring out in discussion viewpoints of all sorts of kinds. And so in my classes, I often have a conversation in which I ask students, well, who has a view on this? And then we go on to say, okay, who has a different view? And then I encourage students not just to be answering me, but to be talking back and forth to one another. And I like to teach in classrooms in which all the chairs are not just facing in one direction, depending on the size of class. Sometimes we're sitting around a table. Sometimes we have chairs in a circle. Sometimes we have an amphitheater type of semicircular classroom. The physical setting helps. But I think it's also important to create the right moral and intellectual tone, which is one of respectful disagreement. And going back in history, whether we're again looking at the people of the Enlightenment, whether we're looking at the scholastics of the medieval period, whether we're looking at the Talmudic scholars, whether we're looking at other people going way back, and I'm just referring to Western culture, no doubt there are examples elsewhere. There are lots of examples to point to in which respectful disagreement and learning from one another and moving the subject forward by combining and entertaining different views has been the essence of the matter. That's how thought moves forward. Well, this is what I've tried to bring to my teaching on the subject.
Would you say we have a responsibility to voice these disagreements as part of our obligation to seek the truth?
Yes, indeed. Not only, but you framing it in terms of obligation to seek truth. I think of it in terms of the role that we play in moving forward. This is how progress is made. This is how science advances. This is how thought in non-scientific disciplines advances also. And look, not everybody is going to want to participate in the intellectual process. and people who don't. But for people who do, then expressing disagreement, and not just expressing disagreement, but trying to understand, why is it that you think this and I think that? Let's get to the core of it. What lies behind that? I think that's, again, that's how progress is made. And if we're going to be willing participants in the intellectual process, then yes, we have an obligation to participate in that way.
Finally, how can schools and universities promote good disagreement?
Well, I've already indicated what I do in my classes, and I don't want to pretend that what I do is the only way to go about it. No doubt there are other ways as well. But I'll tell you what I think does not work. These days, especially in the US, we have a lot of movement toward people being told about the value of entertaining other thoughts and being told about the value of comparing views. I don't think being told matters. It's being told doesn't matter. What matters is doing. And so my recommendation for schools and universities is to create settings, and I think in terms of what happens in the classroom, but you can imagine non-classroom settings as well, create settings in which the doing is part of the activity, not just being told.